Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. In today's episode, I want to talk to you about the continued problems that Russia is having with regards to its oil exports, particularly as a result of the fact that Ukraine has now severely ramped up its drone attacks. It's just been reported that a Russian oil tanker in the port of Tuapse was actually set ablaze by a drone attack. And I think this is the first recorded incident of a tanker actually going on fire as a result of these attacks. And fuel exports from Russia have now plunged to a new low since the war started. We'll have a look at this graph in a moment, which shows each of the years since 2022, and we'll go through the details as to where Russia is right now. But I wanted to just give you a quick update on what's going on with the drones because they have been ramped up. And the Russian Defense Ministry has reported that it's intercepted 100 drones in the past week. Now, obviously, that means that Ukraine is sending significantly more than 100. In fact, it was reported recently that they bombarded the port that we've just talked about with 238 drones. Now, that is a lot of drones to be taking out if you're trying to hit each of them individually. And what we're seeing here is widespread disruption amongst all of Russia's infrastructure because Ukraine is now targeting things like refineries and ports. And it's reported that around 38% of refining capacity is still offline. So that's a problem for Russia because if your refining capacity is offline, then you can't produce as much petrol, diesel, gasoline, all those sorts of things. And so you can't export it and earn money from it, but also you can't provide it to your own people. And that's why there are now shortages. And in some areas, they've still got restrictions in terms of how much you're actually allowed to buy when you go down to the pumps. So just touching on the Tuapse fire, drones hit the oil terminal in Tuapse, which is actually owned by Rosneft, who was recently sanctioned by the USA. And as part of that attack, a tanker that was moored at the port has been set ablaze. The crew were evacuated, and it was reported that flames tore through the export infrastructure within the port. So this could have long-lasting implications for that port. If it can't actually load all of the products onto the tankers, then it will have to stop operating. And that's the sort of thing that Ukraine is obviously trying to achieve with these attacks. And Tuapse handles it's a key port for southern oil shipments to places like China and Turkey. So that's some of the biggest markets that Russia is exporting to. Now, in addition to that attack, there was also an attack on a fuel network near Moscow, and Ukrainian intelligence have claimed that it's destroyed 3 lines of fuel pipelines which move gasoline and jet fuel around Moscow and to military bases. So this is potentially going to impact on both the military side of things, but also on the civilian side. And alongside that, in Oriol, drones struck a pipeline at a power plant that damaged the heating infrastructure. And the city of Oriol apparently lost hot water and heat supply to several districts. So this is now impacting on civilians in Russia. It's not just targeting the export infrastructure, it's actually hitting things like power stations. So that's going to have multiple implications from Russia's perspective. Firstly, there's economic consequences of what happens when you can't export all of your oil products. But more than that, there's also psychological damage because a lot of people in Russia are oblivious to what's happening in Ukraine. It's not actually officially badged as a war. It's a special military operation. And I'm sure a lot of Russians are going about their daily lives ignoring everything. But suddenly when the power goes out or you don't get any hot water or you can't get any gasoline at the pumps, then that tells you that there's something going on that's not just ordinary everyday living. So the implication of the Ukrainian drone attacks is now starting to impact on everyday life in Russia. And that's a problem for President Putin because he's going to have to change the narrative as to what's going on in Ukraine if the war is now coming to Russia's doorstep, which it is. That's what Ukraine is looking to do. It's ramping things up. It's actually sending these drones up to 1,000 miles into Russia. And it's waiting for approval from the USA to use Tomahawk missiles. And if it can do that, then it will have cruise missiles that can go up to 1,500 miles. And they would cause significantly more damage than the drones because they will have a much bigger warhead and they'll be going at a much faster speed. Now let's just have a look at what's happening with Russian exports. So this chart shows the amount that Russia is exporting over the past 3.5 years. So we've got different colours here on the scale on the right hand side, shows the amount of oil being exported or oil products in millions of barrels per day. So we've got four different coloured lines. If we start off with 2022, which was the year when the war started, so it actually kicked off at the end of February. So you can see in January and February, Russia was exporting over 3 million barrels per day. We then saw a sharp fall as the sanctions started to kick in, and there was a lot of upset and dismay amongst the European buyers who previously had been buying tons of oil every single day through all of the pipelines. So we saw the amount being exported fall, and that lasted for around about 6 months. So there's a major impact on Russia's exports. However, it started rising again towards the end of 2022 as Russia diverted its exports to China and India. And prior to 2022, India hadn't bought any Russian oil because logistically it was just too far away. It was too difficult, too expensive. Why would India bother? But obviously, Russia then started offering severe discounts, making it so cheap that India couldn't turn the offer down. So it stepped in and replaced a lot of the European buyers. Now, in 2023, we saw a similar sort of pattern to what we saw in 2022. So initially, at the start of the year, in March, Russia was exporting over 3 million barrels per day. That then started to come down as the sanctions kicked in, and also there was just less trade going on globally. So there was just a lot of uncertainty in the market. So 2023 was a decent year for Russia. It was similar to 2022. 2024, which is shown by the blue line here, shows the impact of the sanctions being ramped up. So the USA started trying to police the sanctions. We saw the price cap being enforced. And so the amount of oil that Russia was exporting fell less than 2 million barrels at one point in April 2024. It then bounced back up. And on average, Russia was exporting somewhere in the region of 2.25 million barrels per day. If we look at the yellow line now, which shows 2025, you can see that at the start of the year, Russia was exporting around about 2.4 million barrels per day. However, over the last 10 months, we have seen that amount consistently coming down, and it's now significantly below 2 million barrels per day. And if you look at the trend here over the past 6 months, you can see we've got a sharp movement downwards. If that continues, then Russia will be exporting less than 1.5 million barrels per day within the next 6 months. And the reason for that is obviously that the USA has now sanctioned Rosneft and Lukoil, and that's really going to hurt Russia because China and India are now pulling back from making these purchases. But in addition to that, we're also seeing the refineries being hit by the drone attacks, which means Russia has less products to actually export. And so it's being hit from both sides. The buyers are more cautious because of the risk of secondary sanctions, and Russia isn't able to actually produce as much oil because it's having all of these infrastructure problems due to the drone attacks. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video because over the past few weeks, we've been talking a lot about drone attacks, and separately, we've been talking about the increase in the sanctions. But in today's video, I wanted to bring the two together because we are now seeing a tangible impact on Russia's exports and therefore, obviously, Russia's income, which is going to have a big impact on Russia's economy. Now, as we talked about at the start of today's video, the drone attacks recently resulted in a tanker going ablaze in one of the Russian ports. And this is a problem because those tankers are not all owned by Russia. Some of them are overseas vessels, and the reports say that one of the overseas vessels was definitely impacted by this drone attack. Now, what that means is that overseas operators might think twice about sending their vessels into Russian ports, because if they're going to come under attack, then basically you're going into a war zone. That's what's happening at some of these ports. And that's what Ukraine is trying to achieve. Firstly, it's trying to take out some of the infrastructure. But secondly, it wants other companies, other countries to think twice about using Russia, sending any of their infrastructure, their vessels, because these things are highly valuable. They're obviously manned by people from those countries. So there's a lot of different implications. Those countries probably wouldn't send their tankers into Ukraine at the moment because it would be deemed to be too dangerous, that you might come under attack. But sending them to Russia is now having the same consequences because Ukraine is able to strike up to 1,000 miles from its borders. So that covers a lot of ports in Russia. So that's a major problem from Russia's point of view. But the fact that this port has been damaged and Russia may not be able to actually export as much oil through that port is also a problem because it's having to fulfill all of the orders that it's still receiving from places like Turkey and China. And as we saw from the charts earlier in the video, the amount of oil exported in October is the lowest single level at any point since the war in Ukraine started. So this is having a really big impact on Russia's revenue that it's earning from oil and gas. That's going to be a big problem because Russia is continuing to spend more than it's earning. So it needs as much revenue as it can get from oil. So as it falls, it's going to put more pressure onto the budget and means that Russia will firstly drain all of the National Wealth Fund to nothing. And then it's going to have to start drawing down some debt. And I recently posted a video talking about the fact that the Russian authorities are now in the process of issuing bonds that will be denominated in Chinese yuan because nobody wants to buy Russian ruble bonds. But in addition to the problems that are going on with regards to the income from oil and gas, there are also issues now within Russia because Russian residents are firstly starting to see the impact of these drone attacks because they're now targeting infrastructure within Russia. So we've seen power stations being taken out of action. And in addition to that, Russian citizens are struggling with regards to oil shortages at their own pumps. So the impact of these drone attacks is now starting to hurt daily life for ordinary citizens in Russia. And that's a problem both in terms of morale and confidence in what's going on from the Russian state's perspective. So there are multiple issues that are now starting to arise within Russia as a result of these drone attacks. And obviously, the sanctions being ramped up are making things worse from Russia's perspective. So we are starting to see a rapid deterioration in oil exports, which will lead to a rapid deterioration in income. And so the Russian economy is now struggling to be able to achieve the 0.6% GDP growth that the IMF recently forecast for 2025. If things continue as they are, then Russia may well see a drop in GDP and could go into recession within the next 3 to 6 months. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's video, you found it useful, informative and thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't done so already. Thank you so much to everyone that's supporting me. If you're a YouTube member or a patron, thank you for that long-term support. And if you bought me a coffee or sent me YouTube super thanks or signed up as a Buy Me a Coffee member, thank you, really appreciate it. And here's something to put a smile on your face.